Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our discussion event on global issues. We'll be getting started here in just a second, so bear with me while I get everything ready here. Okay, welcome everybody to our second discussion event of the 2025 fall 2025 semester. This is Winds of Change, a discussion event on global issues, which is a virtual panel discussion, which is being hosted by the Department of History and Political Science, as well as the School of Arts and Letters here at Middle Georgia State. And our co-sponsors, the MGA Political Science Student Organization and the Alpha Nu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. So before we get started, just a couple of brief informational items about our program here at Middle Georgia State. So our programs in political science include a bachelor's degree in political science, as well as minors in political science, African and African diaspora studies, environmental policy studies, local government administration, global studies, and pre-law, as well as the certificate in European Union studies. And we'll go ahead and introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. So we are joined today by Dr. Matthew Cavally, who's an assistant professor of public safety and has been here as a faculty member at Middle Georgia State since 2016. His doctorate is in political science from the University of Florida. So welcome, Matthew. And also we have Dr. John Hall, who's an associate professor of political science and has been here at Middle Georgia State since 2015. His doctorate in public policy and administration is from Auburn University. And last but not least, I'm your moderator for today, Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm a professor of political science. I've been here since 2012 at Middle Georgia State. And my doctorate in political science is from the University of Mississippi. So as far as the event structure goes, for those of you that have not joined us before, this is how things will work today. So we have a few topics that the panelists and I have selected in conjunction with some other people as well. And we will start with a few of those questions, but we also want your questions as well, and also your follow-up questions. So we do ask any questions you may have in the chat window by clicking on the chat button in Teams. Couple of ground rules on that. First, while you're welcome to ask multiple questions, we do want to prioritize answering at least one question per student or per participant. So if you have multiple questions, we may circle back to you later once everybody has had a chance to ask at least one question. We certainly welcome multiple questions, but we do want to make sure that everybody does get a chance to have their question asked. Also, please be courteous and kind to your fellow MGA community members in the chat window. We appreciate it as always to be upholding those right standards of civility and integrity. So our topics today will potentially include an update on the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza and how that stands at the moment, the impact on foreign assistance cutbacks by the United States, including the shutdown of the USAID agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, escalating conflict with Venezuela and Latin America more generally. What is the status, if any, of the pivot to China? And perhaps also we may get a little bit into the case that the Supreme Court has heard recently about the constitutionality and legality of the tariffs that the administration has been imposing, which is certainly an intermestic issue, as political scientists would put it, has both international and domestic policy implications. So, without too much further ado, I will drop the sharing here and get ready for our first question. And that first question is, so what is the current status of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? And are we any closer to a resolution to the conflict than we were in the spring? And I guess I'll let Dr. Hall lead off.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Thank you, Dr. Cavally, for being here with us. Thank you for the students and other faculty who are here. This should be an invigorating policy discussion on foreign affairs. Regarding the initial question, what is the current status of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Just to catch everyone up, if anyone's not overwhelmingly familiar, I'm going to skip the roughly 1,000-year history that we could go into and just focus on where we are in early 2022, January. Russia invaded illegally the sovereign nation state of Ukraine. That war was supposed to take a couple of days. Everyone, Russia, the United States, NATO, probably everyone except Ukraine, just assumed that Russia would steamroll the Ukrainian military infrastructure such as it was and take over the vast majority of Ukraine, probably putting in a puppet regime in Kyiv. That didn't happen. The overwhelming might of the Russian military was actually pushed back by the Ukrainians. 4 long years later, here we still are with Russia occupying roughly 20% of Ukrainian sovereign soil, mostly in the east and southeastern regions of Ukraine, with basically absolutely no end in sight to the conflict. Again, this has been a brutal and illegal invasion by the Russians into Ukraine. The Ukrainian military, as it grew, the Ukrainian military industrial complex has grown quickly over the last few years. But at the end of the day, this war has turned into what no one ever wants a war to turn into, and that is a war of attrition. This is a war where Russia is trying to kill as many Ukrainian soldiers as possible that can't be replaced. Ukraine is trying to inflict as much damage on Russian energy infrastructure, military infrastructure, and troops. This has been an unimaginably costly war for both sides. We don't have readily available hyper accurate data on casualties, but it's estimated that the Ukrainians have lost well over 50,000 soldiers dead in combat. Russia has estimates of over 250,000 combat kills, upwards of 1 million casualties. This has been overwhelmingly costly to both sides. In terms of where this conflict is going, this is just going to get incredibly depressing. In my opinion, I have nothing necessarily overwhelmingly optimistic. This war continues to rage on and will probably continue to rage on, mainly because the principal variables at play for the Russians and the Ukrainians, there's not a lot of wiggle room for either side. There's a good picture there. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. If you look at the east and southeast of Ukraine, you can see where Russia has control over sovereign Ukrainian soil. It's important to note that the vast majority of what Russia has illegally seized from the Ukrainians happened in the very first year of the war. The Ukrainian military has done an amazing job of stopping the invasion, which at one point, if you notice the light green, blue area, you can see initial advancements getting all the way to the outskirts of Kyiv, but they were pushed back. Russia wants to maintain control of at least the land that they have already taken. Russia also wants guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. Ukraine, however, is of course not going to accept either of those. Ukraine will not accept a promise to never join NATO. Ukraine, especially with the success they've had in repulsing the Russians, I can't imagine that they would ever acquiesce to losing significant land that the Russians have already taken. Basically, when it comes to both sides of the war, what they're looking at are, 1, maintaining enough troops to fight, and 2, outside aid. When it comes to aid to Ukraine, the U.S. and NATO allies have committed and continue to commit an enormous amount of financial reserves toward Ukraine. The U.S. has given over $130 billion. The EU has given over $75 billion, with many billions of euros that have been promised into the future. There are extraordinary economic sanctions that the U.S. and her allies have continuously imposed on Russia that is impacting their economy. Europe itself, especially after the second Trump administration came in and pulled back some of the aid that we were giving freely. We now give aid, but we charge them for it. The NATO nations over the last 4 years are now committing to spending up to 5% of their GDP on military power that could thwart any further Russian aggression. They continue to put more pressure on Russia. In other words, Ukraine while not in an ideal situation, still has an enormous amount of support from her allies, the US, NATO, Japan, among many others. Russia has growing levels of support from its allies, particularly North Korea. China has been extraordinarily effective at violating international sanctions and continuously dealing weapons to Russia. China has also agreed to finish off a massive oil pipeline that will double Russian oil exports to China. Both sides are locked in a war of attrition. Both sides still have significant aid coming in from outside, and that's creating a situation where this war of attrition will probably continue on into the recognizable future. Both sides remain entrenched in their overall positions. Russia will not accept Ukrainian membership in NATO. Ukraine will not accept Russian control over sovereign Ukrainian soil, including the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia took about a decade before this invasion began. We've had a number of failed peace talks, a number of failed ceasefire initiatives. At the end of the day, we are in a situation where Ukraine, I don't believe, will acquiesce to Russia's demands because they don't necessarily have to. 4 years later, and what we thought was a global superpower in Russia in early 2022 has been continuously and successfully pushed back by the Ukrainian forces. Russia is in a position where President Putin, I don't know if he can acquiesce and pull back, because as most authoritarian leaders experience, defeats of this nature that have absolutely nothing to show for it at the end and hundreds of thousands of Russian dead, I don't know if Putin has the ability to pull back. So I could keep talking about this for a long time, but I'm going to make myself stop there by unfortunately saying, while this war of attrition continues to grind on, costing unnecessarily tens of thousands of lives on both sides, I just don't see a realistic option in the future for it to peacefully end anytime soon. I think the single best opportunity, not that I'm advocating for anyone to murder anyone, but I think the best opportunity would be some kind of a coup in the Kremlin forces or the political or economic elite around Putin, orchestrating some kind of a regime change. But outside of that, I see this continuing for quite some time. I'll turn it over to Matt to fill in the mini blanks. Matt is definitely going to be the expert here with far more military service.
Well, I don't think there's too much really to fill in. The only thing I would say, as far as there is a remnant asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine, and now to a certain extent, the Ukrainians have the defender's advantage. And what I mean by that is that if you look at military doctrine, what you'll see is in a conventional war, which is what most of this conflict is, you need about 3 times as many soldiers on offense as you have on defense. And so the Ukrainians have the defender's advantage, and that even though they're a smaller population and a weaker economy, and just overall generally a lower power nation state, they don't need as many resources. They don't need as many troops. They don't need as many supplies and chains of supply and so on and so forth, because they're on the defense. And even in terms of what they call lines of supply, that also advantages the Ukrainians, because the Russians, or any group that are on the offense, they have more extended lines of supply. And so there's been a pattern that happens in the Russian-Ukrainian war, that the Russians tend to hit with drones and missiles and artillery fire when they get close enough, and they also hit them with air when they can, and naval, and at least in the Baltic and whatnot. But they hit them, and then they send in their motorized infantry, supported by armor and under the fire of artillery, and that goes on, and then they get stopped. And what stops them is that the Ukrainians don't break. They hold their line, and because they hold their line, what happens? The Russians exceed their lines of supply, and by exceeding their lines of supply, they then have to stop and pull back. And so what you have is an accordion effect, and that's what goes on all over the of the border region there, and that's been happening for a long time. Now the Russians are one where they're running an offensive right now. So their classic line, by the way, when they do an offensive, is that they hit the Ukrainian major industrial and energy infrastructure, and their attempt is to knock that out, and their telecommunications infrastructure and stuff like that, so that they can then steamroll. And that's old Soviet doctrine. That goes back to the Warsaw Pact. But the problem that they have is that the Ukrainians have done a good job of putting redundancies in effect. They have some of the best first response to those things. They'll lose a hospital, we'll say, and they'll get one set back up within a matter of hours to days, and then that keeps them in the fight. Now, having said all that, the great weakness the Ukrainians have and the great strength that the Russians have is that the Russians have people in a way that the Ukrainians don't. And the Russians operate from, to some extent, the Ukrainians do too, but the Russians operate from the Eastern way of war. And this is something that is very alien to those of us in the West. They can lose 100 and 200 and 300 and 400 and 500. There's some estimates say that total they've had like 750,000 casualties, the Russians. Now, by the way, casualties are broken up into two groups. There's wounded and killed. So there's almost always more wounded than there are killed. But that's a tremendous amount. Listen, that's more than what the United States has in its entire U.S. Army. It's almost twice, actually, and they keep going. But that's the Eastern way of war. So in the war of attrition, the great advantage that the Russians have is that they can just keep putting men and material forward, and they don't care that they're losing people, and that's the real difference. And I think if there's anything, if the political difficulty the Ukrainians might have, because they have a system of government that is, roughly speaking, democratic. If that system of government, if the people of the Ukraine reach a point where they say, well, you know what, we'd like Crimea and we'd like Donbass, but you know what, we'll give it up to have peace. And that could be a way out. But of course, you see, I hope that doesn't happen. And here's why I say that hope doesn't happen. Why I hope that doesn't happen. Because if that does happen, all that's going to do is feed the Russian lust for power. And they'll say, oh, so you mean what we did in Georgia and what we did in Chechnya, now what we've done in Ukraine, this has all worked. And then that means that particularly if they team up with, increasingly they're teaming up with Belarus and Moldova, and of course Georgia, which used to be kind of an enemy, is now a friend with them. They got buddy with Orban in Hungary, which is an insurgency within NATO. Hungary's a NATO country. That would incite them to go forward, and in particular, with some of the stuff that's out there with the Trump doctrine of America First. There's some question, if they really did push up against a NATO country, if they pushed up against Poland, would the United States lead a NATO reaction? There's some question under that regarding President Trump, because I remember him giving a speech, or he was speaking from the Oval Office, and he said, well, if we got in trouble, do you really think the French would help us? And he did this whole thing, but that sent a message I'm not sure the president realized that, but that sent a message to the Russians that we might not live up to our commitments, and so that's a really scary thing. But that's the real danger, is that now will the Politburo, will the Kremlin get tired? Not the Politburo, not Politburo, anyway. Will the Kremlin get tired of President Putin doing this kind of stuff? Well, you could say there's a hope for that, and I kind of join John in that hope. But I will say that the difficulty is they are the people that put up with Stalin, and they are the people. They called him Ivan the Terrible for a reason. It wasn't because he was a nice guy. And Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and they've got a long history of this near abroad imperialism stuff. And even if we get a resolution of that conflict, which I hope that we do, I still would worry about the continued advancement of the Russians. They've long had a desire to occupy their supposed near abroad, and they don't have a problem with imperialization because it's part of who they are. It's how Russia was built. So it's a dangerous commodity out there. But you got to. I'll close out. I will say this: you have to give it up to the Ukrainians for their steadfast ability to hold off against. The Russians do an offensive like every 6 to 9 months. They do a major offensive. They're in one right now, by the way. They're trying to isolate a pocket, and they're trying to put what's called an encirclement. I don't know if they'll get it or not, but they're trying to do that because if they do enough of those, they feel they can break that line. I don't know. This is an old idea. The Germans used to try this in World War I. It never worked for them, but we'll see if the Russians can pull it off. But this is dangerous time with them. So I'll close off on that. Hopefully, some of the tactical discussion wasn't too much over people's heads, and they got that. But it's a scary time that we're in.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cavali. I guess we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. And by the way, just as a reminder, don't forget that we are taking, we happily will take your questions from the chat as well. So please post any questions you may have or follow-ups in the chat if you do have questions. So our second question that we prepared beforehand is, how is the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza progressing, and what are the prospects for a longer-term resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now that there is a ceasefire in place? And I'll let Dr. Cavali lead off on that one.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I'll just say this at the beginning here. I want to thank everybody for attending this today's panel, and for Professor Hall and Professor Lawrence for putting this thing together. So I suppose I could do the same. I could do a thing. We could talk about several hundred years of history, but we don't need to do that. But I will say this: the Gaza war is one in a series of Arab-Israeli wars that have been going on and off since 1948. And it's in a particular subgroup of the latter Arab-Israeli wars that were centered around the Israelis and the Palestinians. And these date back to the 1980s. And in fact, Hamas, as an organization, used to be a part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And when the PLO said, well, we'll sit down with the Israelis, a splinter group in them said, no, we won't. And they broke off, and they created Hamas. And so that was in 1987. That initiated what's called the first intifada. The difference between the intifadas and the previous Arab-Israeli wars, Arab-Israeli wars were a lot like the Russia-Ukrainian war. They were conventional wars, whereas the intifadas forward have been unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, and which on the side of the Israelis is counterinsurgent or counter-guerrilla warfare, something that Americans we know a lot about from our experience in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, but even us way back when it was the Indian Wars and the Philippine insurrection and stuff. The Israelis are actually occupying the kind of position, say, we did in the Vietnam War, and Hamas is occupying the position, say, the Viet Cong did in the Vietnam War. So, but anyway, that's a little background. So the latest fight began in a couple years ago on October the 7th, 2023. The Hamas launched a massive strike into Israel. They took hostages. They killed people. They assassinated people. They raped women. They killed children. They did all manner of horrific things that are often associated with insurgents and, for that matter, terrorists. And by the way, that Hamas is an officially recognized terrorist organization, and they have committed terrorist acts against all kinds of, mostly against Israelis, but they've also, through their networks, worked with other terrorist organizations, even against the United States and some of our allies. They're not good people. Say that. But having said that, Hamas attained a degree of legitimacy in 2007 because they created a political party and they won control of Gaza. Now, they operate independently of the Palestine Authority, which controls the West Bank. But nonetheless, they are, to some extent, a legitimized political entity. Even though we here in America, we don't recognize them as such, we still say they're terrorists, and so do the Israelis, and so do the British and French and many other places. But Hamas has received recognition, perhaps not surprisingly, from people like the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese. And if you see a little pattern there, you should recognize that. But what we have had is a brutal fight, and it's been another advance of asymmetric warfare. Hamas has done what insurgents have often done, terrorists have often done. One of the rules of that of terrorism and insurgency is that it's the weapon of the weak against the strong. And how you can do that is you embed yourself within the civilian population. You essentially hide behind them. You use them as barricades. You use their infrastructure for your infrastructure. And what that means is that forces the conventional entity and the counter-terror or counterinsurgent activity to have to hit the otherwise civilian infrastructure and to have to hit the otherwise civilians caught in between. And so, there's numbers that have come out, they've taken somewhere upwards of 70,000 casualties, and Hamas claims that half of those were women and children. So, which overwhelmingly would have been civilian non-combatants. But that is a result of how they do that kind of warfare, and they do that kind of warfare because of their asymmetric power position. They're at the bottom. All right. Now we get to how we got to end this, the ceasefire. Well, we had a ceasefire several months ago, and that fell apart. And so they tried again. And they think they got one. And the one that they have now has 3 parts to it. And the first part was to stop fighting and have an exchange of prisoners, which had made it amount to basically the Israelis have given up mostly live prisoners, and the Hamas has given up mostly dead prisoners, mostly remains of people that they had, some of which they had captured way back 2 years ago on October 7th. Then the second part of it is for the Hamas to step back as the political ruling entity in Gaza. And supposedly within that, they're supposed to lay down their arms. And then finally, along with that, then the Israelis will have a segmented withdrawal. And that just means that they'll withdraw in pieces. And so a kind of a slow retreat. And so that they can maintain their lines of strength. And that's an old concept of withdrawal that's done. And eventually they'll be outside of Gaza. And so Gaza will be back under Palestinian control. But the controlling feature will be somebody that is not Hamas. And then finally, they'll have an international stabilizing force of peacekeepers who will come in, which will include some elements of command and control of Americans, of American forces. In fact, there are the initial form for that group. There's about 200 American forces on the ground right now. And so those peacekeepers, so the idea of peacekeeping is that you have a third party intervener who comes in, who's going to be a neutral broker. And they're going to set their troops in between the two warring sides, the two conflictual sides. And basically what that means is, okay, you guys can't shoot at each other, because if you did, you'd shoot at us. And if you shoot at us, we're going to shoot it back at you. And basically it makes people behave themselves. That's the idea. This concept of peacekeeping has been around a long time. The UN has been doing it for a long time. NATO's been doing it for a long time. The US has been doing it for a long time. The Israelis don't have much experience with that, but nonetheless, that's what they're going to have. So now here comes the problems. Well, Hamas does not want to put down their guns. Israel wants more guarantees before they completely pull out. The creation of the stabilization force is coming under some domestic pressure back here in the States. There are people within President Trump's own party, the Republican Party, who said, now, wait a minute, you told us when you ran for office we weren't going to have any more wars, and we weren't going to spend any more money overseas, and we weren't going to do this, and we weren't going to put boots on the ground, we weren't going to have a second Iraq war or anything like that. And here you are doing this stuff. I mean, what's the difference between you and Biden? So we've got that going on. And finally, like most ceasefires, all fire has not actually ceased. These cats are still shooting at each other in pockets, and they're still doing things, and there's still terroristic incidents happening. And the Israelis are still taking the heavy-handed response. And so, in certain portions of Gaza, Israel has reduced it basically to a Paleolithic age society. And that's because they have the power to do it. But also the Israeli, and this is something that Americans sometimes have a problem with, the Israeli doctrine of warfare. So have you ever run into somebody who was a veteran of the IDF, they'll kind of make fun if you're an American. Because the Israeli Defense Forces doctrine is basically this: if you kill one of us, we're going to kill 100 of you. And where they go back on that is they say that we will not go back quietly into the gas chambers. And so then the IDF's vision is that part of what happened in the Holocaust in Germany was that the Jews did not fight back. They didn't organize, they didn't fight back. And when they did, it was too late. It was like at the Warsaw Ghetto and stuff where it was too late. And so they say, well, never again. And so they have become a very militarized society, and they hit with a heavy hand. They follow a doctrine of total war. And that's something that's very hard for Americans, because we don't We haven't done that in a long time. We haven't done that since World War II, and it's difficult for us to recognize that. But that's what's going on there. So, will this ceasefire hold? Well, I hope it does. I hope it does, because every day that the ceasefire lasts, that conflict can be muted, can be reduced, is a day where there's a greater chance for a larger peace. And one thing that gets lost in all of this, Jews and Arabs lived together for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. They intermarried, they dealt with each other, their clerics worked together. They're not internally bent on conflict toward one another, despite the way that it's presented in the media a lot of times. They can get along. They have gotten along. They've proven that they can get along. During World War II, they worked together against the British in Palestine. So there is a potential for them to deal with one another in an equitable manner. Now, whether that's ultimately a two-state solution or something within an autonomous region or something like that, but there could be a pathway to peace. But if we have to get them to stop killing each other, because every time you kill somebody, their family member says, never again, and I'm going to go after you. At a certain point, somebody has to say, it's terrible that I lost my loved one, but I'm going to choose peace instead of war. And that's what, right now, neither side seems to be too willing to do that. But there's a lot of people that are starving to death because of it, not just in Gaza, but all around the world. If you look at most of the difficulties that are around the world, at their base is warfare. So anyway, I'm going to shut up on that. Although I did see something in the chat. What happened? There's something about, let's see, has the weakening of Iran slowed down the use of proxy conflict? It was the real purpose of October 7th, Hamas uprising, stopping the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia. Well, Douglas, that's a very good question, and it is possible that certain elements, as far as the Abraham Accords. So Hamas dislikes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as almost as much as the Israelis do. As far as being a proxy conflict goes, now with Iran, it's always difficult. So for years, the Iranians didn't care much for Hamas. They didn't care much for Hamas because the Iranians were Shiites and the Hamasins were Sunnis. But Iran, after the first Ayatollah died, under the new Ayatollah, they began to moderate on that issue, and a lot of it was because of the whole the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. And so they, while they still continue to support Hezbollah, which is a Shiite organization, they moved over to support Hamas. In fact, Iran is the greatest financial contributor to backing of Islamo-fascist terrorism all over the world. So is it to stop the Abraham Accords? That's a very strong possibility. Yes. What gives a terrorist or an insurgent group, what gives them power, is when they can compel others to buy into their ideology, and then compel their enemies to adjust their policies out of fear of that organization. And so as long as Hamas is seen as a heroic figure to take on the great Satans of the United States and Israel, that's the way the concepts that they like to talk about, they will use that. And so that's another thing, is that you got to get around ideas. So anyway, hopefully that helped a little bit. I'm going to turn things back over to John.
Thank you, Matt. That was a incredibly thorough analysis there. I don't really have much to add. I would say in terms of the prospects for the ceasefire continuing and peaceful coexistence, I am in no way optimistic, mainly because of the unique nature of October 7th and the terror attack. That broke something in the Israeli political psychology. When you mentioned, Dr. Kavli mentioned earlier that in 2007, Hamas, the recognized terrorist organization, won democratic elections in Gaza, and they have since never held elections again. But right before that, the Israelis controlled Gaza. The Israelis had settlers in Gaza, and the Israelis unilaterally pulled everyone out of Gaza and handed Gaza over to the Palestinians, who then elected democratically Hamas. For the next 2 decades almost, Hamas-led Gaza would spend absolutely all of their energy building tunnels to attack the Israelis. They would buy and or be given rocket systems to attack Israel. For the better part of 2 decades, the Israelis had to get used to Gaza under Hamas's leadership, sending indiscriminate rocket attacks into populated areas. The Israelis coexisted with this to such an extent that they, along with U.S. research and development and their own, created one of the most sophisticated anti-air missile defense systems in the world, particularly the Iron Dome, David Sling. There's a third tier of anti-air defense that they've developed. Israel developed one of the single most sophisticated and successful anti-missile defense systems ever developed, specifically to coexist with Hamas next door. The Israelis, for the better part of 2 decades, were fully prepared to do whatever was needed to coexist with a Gaza that was led by Hamas. But October 7th broke something in Israel. They will never again, I say never, but maybe a dramatic change in leadership later in time. But for now, there is absolutely no interest whatsoever in Israel for Hamas to in any way have political power in Gaza. That is a new development. And I cannot imagine in my wildest dreams that Hamas would actually do the right thing. And in order to maintain the ceasefire and a peaceful transition, and even possibly a 2-state solution, that Hamas would ever actually, throw down their power. I cannot imagine Hamas doing that. So I think that's the major difference here, that Israel is not going to live with Gaza that is controlled by Hamas ever again. And that is a deal breaker. And I don't see Hamas acquiescing and stepping down. Back to the question regarding Iran. Great point there regarding the Iranian intentions of throwing off some of the most important peace talks in the history of Israel and Saudi Arabia. That was successful. But beyond that, I think the October 7th attack was a massive disaster. It was probably the dumbest thing. Most evil, yes, also, but just strategically, I think Hamas made a huge mistake on October 7th. They unleashed the Israeli Defense Force. And if you just look at Gaza now, there's no way that Hamas would have expected this response from Israel. Israel took all of the gloves off after the horror of October 7th. They actually even went in to Lebanon and annihilated major infrastructure of Hezbollah. They went into Syria up near the Golan Heights, and the Israelis, taking off the gloves as they did after October 7th, have the resulting international order, at least within the Levant area there, is that Hamas is exponentially weaker than it was before. Hezbollah exponentially weaker than it was before. So I think that was a calculated error on the part of the Iranians. And it's important to point out that Iran could not care less about Hamas and whether or not they die. Again, like Dr. Kavli pointed out, they are Sunni, Iran is Shia. But again, while I have no idea, my theory on the prospects for a lasting peace are very, very low. I don't think there is any taste for a 2-state solution in Israel right now. There's absolutely no possibility of acquiescing to Hamas leading Gaza. And even if we get to the point where the Palestinian Authority, leading the West Bank now, does take administrative control over Gaza, there's really no indication that the Palestinian Authority would be able to pull that off. So my My thoughts on the prospects for peace in this particular situation are incredibly negative for those reasons. October 7th was just such a horrible attack on the Israelis that I think it fundamentally changed the equation, if not forever, but for the foreseeable future. Pound for pound, per capita, the number of Israelis who died on October 7th was greater than the number of Americans who died on September 11th. That was the Israeli 9/11. So I hope I'm wrong, and I hold out hope for peace and a ceasefire that works and a two-state solution, but I just don't see that. Not after October 7th. That was depressing. Sorry I ended it like that.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Okay, so we'll move on to another question. Actually, this is one that Douglas sent us by email before the event. And by the way, again, don't forget that we are taking questions and follow-ups by chat. So the question is about what will be the impact of the reductions in the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, on our allies, and also, I guess, other states that benefited from that assistance, especially those needing any pivot towards China and our ongoing relationships in Africa and Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam. So very in-depth question there. I'll let Dr. Hall lead off on that one.
Great question there. This is one that we've had an eventful 2025. This is one of the Trump administration's policy directives that has surprised me the most, that it is not a bigger deal, that this isn't something that is still front page. The United States of America began a program in the early 1960s. And from that point forward and until this year, the United States is the single leading nation state in terms of foreign aid to nation states who have populations that need assistance. There is no individual nation that gives as much as the United States gives. Now, as a percentage of our GDP, we actually aren't even in the top 10, but in terms of just the sheer volume of aid that the United States gives to the international community, we have led the world. And we've done that predominantly through the USAID. That's the U.S. Agency for International Development, developed in the early 1960s. This program, from its inception, has brought life-saving medicine, food, clean water, protection for women, for children. It has been unimaginably successful at alleviating the suffering around the world that is caused by one of the single most, by far, evil of all evils, and that is poverty. This program has been very successful. And as a percentage of our overall federal budget, it was less than 1%. So while the last data I saw for USAID was around $63 billion per year, that is a small drop in terms of the overall federal budget. The Trump administration initially, and this was, I think, a day one or day two policy decision, basically gutted USAID. And as recently, I think it's July, the program was effectively killed. And what remains of USAID has been kind of lumped into the State Department. But this program has been instrumental in not just saving lives around the world on a daily basis. It has been instrumental in increasing American soft power. And when you talk about soft power, that is a concept that, to juxtapose it to hard power, the nation's hard power is an aircraft carrier or an F-35 or a U.S. combat marine. Soft power is influence. It's what you get when you act as a responsible global leader, and the respect that comes with it and the influence that comes with it. And the U.S. has been incredibly successful with the USAID program. Now it's basically gone, and the effects are going to be felt and have been felt immediately. The success of the USAID program in alleviating the dangers of poverty are all being basically, now reversed. The estimates on what this means are horrifying. They're estimated about over 20 million children worldwide are going to lose access to education that they had under support from USAID. Almost 100 million people are going to lose access to basic health care, which they had that under USAID. And estimates are that there could be upwards of 3 million people who die every year from completely preventable causes. This is an estimate, but when you wrap your mind around that, 3 million human beings around the world who very well may die because of the aid that the U.S. used to give them that no longer is coming. So that is the overall quick summary of what has happened to U.S. aid. And the Trump administration has done this under the same, policy platform of DOGE and cutting government cost. What we see, however, is that this is going to have an incredible impact beyond the lives that will be lost because of the absence of the U.S. aid that was there since the 1960s. This is going to open up major vacuums around the world that the United States is effectively pulling out of, and China is right there moving in. Russia is even right there moving in. U.S. influence will be curbed by the lack of the overwhelming support that we get from the aid program that we've been discussing. It's also, and this is interesting in terms of the U.S. being a liberal democracy with representative government, getting rid of U.S. aid is shockingly unpopular. When polled, Americans, about 2/3 of Americans say, no, we do not want to get rid of this. No, we do not want to cut back on U.S. aid to those living in poverty. Almost half of registered Republicans say they do not like getting rid of U.S. aid, and yet we have. This is going to have negative impacts on U.S. influence around the world. This is obviously going to have negative impacts on the people who are going to die as a result of it. And it's not popular with Americans. Actually, when polled, Americans, a majority of Americans actually want, it was in the 90% range, want to actually spend more than the Trump administration is wanting to spend on foreign aid. So the ramifications of getting rid of U.S. aid are going to be quite dramatic in terms of lives lost, and also dramatic in terms of lost influence by the United States. We are stepping back as a global power with this dramatic cut to U.S. foreign aid. And it's going to have impacts. Specifically with Vietnam, it is going to dramatically debilitate our ability to continue post-war programs like the Agent Orange cleanup programs that scour the landscape for unexploded ordnance, of which there is an enormous amount, particularly along the border. It is going to reduce the influence of the United States of America in areas like Vietnam and Southeast Asia, incredibly important geopolitical regions of the planet. We are unilaterally stepping back and creating a vacuum that will allow other nation states like China to come in and increase their influence. So that's the quick summary of U.S. aid. It can come back in a future administration. The overwhelming and rapid annihilation of this program has been questioned before the court. But again, this is something that for now, it appears to be gone, and it will have dramatic impacts, and none of them positive, other than the fact that the wealthiest nation state in the history of the world will save $63 billion a year. And I'll turn that over to Matt. That was another depressing ending.
So that was very good. Very good. The only thing I'd like to add is just a couple of minor things. One is this. So how USAID got deconstructed was the Trump administration's interpretation of its own victory based around its campaign. So when then former, now current President Trump was running for re-election in 2024, he said that if you put me back in power, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to root out all the corruption and the fraud and the wasteful spending and cut that back on the bureaucracy and reduce the size of government and bring it back closer to the people. We're going to make America great again. And so he got back into power, and one of the ways that he interpreted his electoral mandate was that we're going to look at certain agencies that have always had a kind of conservative crosshairs on them. USAID was one of those. And we're going to root out the corruption and the so on and so forth. And to be fair, there have been some elements of of poor contracting and wasteful bureaucratic spending and excesses and things of delivering aid that then never got out to the people and improper policing of it and so on and so forth. However, there was not evidence, at least it has not been presented, I'll say this, of systematic corruption within AID, or for that matter, any of these agencies. And so it was a fulfillment of a campaign promise, but it was a fulfillment in a way that caught at least the media and many in public opinion, as Professor Hall has pointed out here, by surprise. People expected maybe a reduction perhaps in the size of an agency like AID, not that AID would actually be destroyed. Now, on that note, the empowerment for AID actually originates with the Congress. So the Congress passed a law and it said, Mr. President, you got to set up an agency to coordinate humanitarian economic assistance, that's foreign aid. And so in other words, non-military foreign aid. And President Kennedy in 1961, he did that. He set up AID. And AID originally was in the State Department. And then in a reorganization in 1998, the Clinton administration made it independent agency, independent of the State Department. And to some extent, what the Trump administration did is they just sort of reverse order, and it rather than putting the agency back underneath state, they took the functions out of it and shoved it underneath state. But see, this is where Professor Hall was alluding to that there's some legal difficulty, because in '98 Congress told the president, you can either scuttle it or you can reestablish it as an independent regulatory agency. And Clinton reorganized it as an independent agency. Well, there's some question then, well, if it's reestablished as an independent agency, does the president then retain the power to shut it down? And so President Trump just assumed, well, I have this power, I'm going to do it, and this is what he did. But there is some legal, so that's a kind of a legal thing. But what also Professor Hall was pointing out, because of that statutory background, if we play a hypothetical here, you could have a president in the future. We could have a President Chris Lawrence, and President Lawrence could say, well, you know what, I'm going to stand AID back up. And under the current legal structure, he easily could. Which is, I'll just say that is one of the things about the governing via executive orders and reorganization authority and stuff that's exclusive to the executive branch. The great difficulty with that is it has a potential to not live on. And so if you want your stuff to live on, you need to change the law. And I question whether the Trump administration could actually get a change in law on that. So that's a little nuances on it, but that's an interesting thing. That, in other words, it could be like a phoenix; it could rise again depending on it. But in terms of foreign aid, it's not just that America is the number one provider of foreign aid, or was the number one provider of foreign aid with in terms of monies relative to other nation states, and relative to everybody else, to everything else. There are no entities out there. If you put all of the nonprofits out there together, they don't give anywhere near what a nation state does, especially what the United States did. And so there are difficulties in some of these things, and I'll quiet down on this, but I'll just use an example, the HIV program in Africa. And well, you might say, well, who cares, right? Who cares? How's that going to? Well, listen, we live in an age of global travel. And if we have another epidemic of HIV in Africa, and people, they travel, they work, they all around the world, we could have another global pandemic of that very horrific disease. By the way, that effort by AID in Africa regarding HIV, that was not a product intrinsically of Democratic presidents. I'll tell you, the one that did the most to do that was George W. Bush. He was the one that did the most for that program, and he's a fellow Republican. I do wonder about these kinds of things, because we will feel this. We're going to talk a little bit about trade later on, hopefully. But see, in trade, it's the same thing. What you think it will is just isolated. It turns out it's not isolated, and so we have a lot of those things. You could argue things about some of the public health stuff, same thing, but it comes in. Anyway, I'm going to quiet down about that, but it's something to think about on there. I think somebody did put something else in the chat. What do we got going on here? This is from Justin. Knowing this, will there be significant legal and social ramifications with how the Trump administration has handled foreign affairs that can never be recoverable in, let's say, 20 years from now? Well, that's an interesting question. That's a hypothetical, and the best answer anybody can give is we don't know. But I do want to say this: policies tend to produce path dependencies that live on. And so if we have created a new climate wherein the United States will continue to step back from international leadership, and that lives on beyond the Trump administration, not just within the Republican Party, but if it's adopted by elements of the Democratic Party, and so on and so forth, you could very well see a very different world. And so one of the things that has kind of put the lid on great power conflict has been the lines of interconnection between different nation states and different peoples and different non-state actors around the world, multinational corporations. That there's incentives to cooperate, not to conflict, because of all these connections. Foreign aid is one of those elements that connects people around the world. And so when you reach back on some of these lines of connection, for good, bad, or indifferent reasons, but it can have the externality of promoting conflict over cooperation, from the, if you will, the realism paradigm of international relations over the liberal idealism paradigm. And what can you have from that? Great power conflict leads to great war. And so part of, the whole foreign aid mechanism of AID, it came out of the Cold War. It was how we were going to beat the Soviets. We were going to beat them with to use Joseph Nye's term, our soft power. He did with economic interdependence, but that foreign aid lied at the front, because, you got to develop economies and you got to protect societies before you can have economic interdependencies develop. And so that was the purpose behind it. And as Professor Hall pointed out, power never rests in a vacuum. And in that vacuum on foreign aid, the Chinese and the Russians have been stepping in. The Chinese in particular, they have this initiative. And here's how they do foreign aid, though. They mostly do it through loans. And so what that means is that puts the lended country under not just the economic influence, but the political power of China. And if you want a world that is more democratic, if you want a world that is more free market and less mercantilistic than in activity, then foreign aid helps you to sell that message for good, bad, or indifferent reasons, but it depends what you want. Let's see here. Well, okay, we got somebody here, and I'll turn over to John to answer this question, since he did such a great job with the Israelis and the Gazans. That this is about. I'll just read it here. The International Association of Genocide Scholars found in August 2025 that Israel's military action on Gaza meets the legal definition of genocide. Also, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry says the same. These statements coincide with horrific images and videos I see. I'm thinking that with all the Hamas talk about it being a terrorist organization and it being the reason for the brutality that's happening, would it not shift the focus away from the actual brutal killings of innocent Palestinian civilians and the years-long injustice they have faced at the hands of Israelis? Because from what I'm hearing, we are always using the terms Hamas and almost never Palestinians. Are we saying Israel's politics of fear is justifying what they have done, and it is only through Hamas standing down that there will be peace? So I could respond to that, but I thought that Professor Hall might prefer to respond to that. I don't know.
That's a powerful question that we could spend the rest of the night on. Really quickly, going back to what we were looking at, how will this affect the United States in terms of foreign affairs? I would go so far as to say it will affect us. It's showing a possible danger of America's democratic elected system. We can go from one administration to the next, Democrat to Republican, back and forth, but over time, we need to maintain a consistency with regard to foreign policy, which we historically have. We can go Democrat, Republican throughout the Cold War, but both sides wanted to maintain the fight against the Soviet Union. We can look at foreign aid. As Dr. Caverly pointed out, it was George W. Bush who did the lion's share of work with combating HIV AIDS in Africa. What this is doing is showing that it is possible for the United States to elect a president who will dramatically change all U.S. foreign policy in ways that we never could have imagined before. It makes us look like an unreliable partner. So I think that will have an effect. I don't think it will be permanent. I think it can be recovered from. But regarding the very complex question that was just asked here, in terms of the International Association of Genocide Scholars finding that Israel's military action on Gaza meets the legal definition of genocide, that I don't in any way agree with from the perspective of intent. The Israelis, and again, this is a complex, tricky area. These are dangerous waters to walk through. But when it comes to the Israeli Defense Force, they want to destroy Hamas. They, like all other liberal democracies, the United States included, they aggressively don't want to deal with civilian casualties, because civilian casualties will make the planet Earth turn against you. So not necessarily even from an altruistic perspective, just from a common sense perspective, the IDF killing tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians in Gaza is something that is politically devastating for the Israelis. They will drop pamphlets on top of buildings prior to an airstrike saying, we are about to strike this building. I'm not in any way putting a good versus bad in terms of the Israelis and versus the Palestinians. I mean, from the perspective of common sense, the Israelis, like the U.S., want to avoid civilian casualties. When it comes to Hamas, and this is one of those elements that you can recognize in a terrorist organization, Hamas would have rocket systems that would be next door to a kindergarten. They had the largest hospital in Gaza City. Hamas's headquarters was underneath that hospital, which is by itself a recognized war crime. Hamas is extraordinarily evil. Hamas wants dead Palestinians because Hamas knows that dead Palestinian civilians will lead to global sentiment turning against Israel and in favor of having Israel pull back. Cannot stress this enough. I'm not saying this from the perspective of one side being good, one side being bad. It's just from a military strategic standpoint, the Israelis are not trying to murder all Palestinians in Gaza. They are trying to, and are being relatively successful at destroying all of the infrastructure of Hamas. And in the process, they have unfortunately killed tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian civilians. But again, it brings up the ancient and eternal question: if someone is shooting a gun into your house and they have children in front of them and they're shooting actively into your house, what are you going to do? Despite your attempts at not having civilian casualties, if you do strike back against a terrorist organization that, as Dr. Caverly mentioned, is hiding behind civilians purposefully, it creates an untenable situation, which in the past, the Israelis dealt with anti-air defense systems that allowed them to coexist with a Hamas-led Gaza. After October 7th, that's what really broke the Israelis in terms of refusing to coexist with Hamas ever again. having said that, your question has a lot of other elements that I don't know if I necessarily addressed. But it is important to note that there is a difference between Hamas and the Palestinians. And I would argue that Hamas has been just as devastating to the Palestinians as the IDF has. I'm going to step my toes out of this incredibly dangerous water and turn it over to Matt or to Chris to fill in any blanks regarding the Israelis committing genocide in Gaza.
Let's see. So a couple of things I should point out, and probably something that I should remember to point out at the beginning of each of these discussions, is that all opinions expressed by the panelists, including myself and Dr. Cavalier and Dr. Hall, are their individual opinions and not the opinions of Middle Georgia State University or any of our employers or the administrators at this administration, at this institution, because I'm sure they would not like us to put words in their mouths, for lack of a better word. I think that we're dealing with an extraordinarily complex issue that the terminology sometimes gets in the way of analysis, and what I mean by that is that that people use terms like genocide deliberately because they're provocative, and so it gets in the way of the question of, well, as Dr. Hall was saying, intent, right? And certainly, and also scale and magnitude and things like that. I mean, I think that there's certainly, you could talk about specific examples of situations where, the IDF has, or elements within the IDF have done things that, contravene the laws of war. And certainly on the West Bank, you've seen examples of settlers and things like that engaging in attacks, indiscriminate attacks against Palestinian civilians and things like that. So there are certainly violence that has been perpetuated against civilians on both sides. But as Dr. Hall also pointed out, right? I mean, if you're going to talk about genocide, I mean, it would be hard to argue that the October 7th attacks on Israelis were not genocidal in their nature as well, in the sense that they were intended to wipe out large numbers of people based on their ethnicity or their perceived ethnicity. In the case that many of those people were not even Israelis or Jews, but the intent was definitely to engage in. And historically, right, it would be hard to disentangle the entire history of the Levant from a discussion of ethnic cleansing and genocide more broadly, right? I mean, you could argue that all the wars that were launched against Israel were genocidal and intended to ethnically cleanse the region in their effect, and the effect of most countries in the Middle Eastern policies since World War II has been the ethnic cleansing of Jews from their territory. Is that a genocide? I think there's lots of genocide going around in the Middle East, and again, I don't know that it's necessarily talking about one side being genocidal and another side not being genocidal is not terribly analytically useful. And particularly when one side is just better at warfare than the other, for lack of a better way of putting it. I think, given our time constraints here, probably it's best to move on and address some other questions. Let's see. Let's go with the question about Venezuela and what's going on in the Caribbean. So, what is the real strategy behind the strikes and war posture? And what is the fundamental purpose behind what is happening in the region? Is it to distract from domestic concerns? Is there a genuine desire to regime change in Venezuela? Is it an attempt to perhaps weaken Cuban influence in the region? Is it genuinely some sort of concern about drug trafficking? And how would you characterize that situation? I guess I think it's Dr. Cavalier's turn to lead off, if I'm not mistaken. So I will let him do so.
All right, I'll give it a whirl. Ostensibly, I mean, it's part of the war on drugs, and the idea is that in some ways it's not new. So the United States has utilized military assets in one form or another, and intelligence assets in one form or another ever since the onset of the declaration by President Nixon of a war on drugs in 1971. That militarization, though, picked up beginning in the late 1980s as George H.W. Bush was coming into office. And he initiated the actual usage of the military, empowered the military as a police force, if you will, police action, use a little Truman-esque terminology, with the invasion of Panama, and to initiate regime change there on the Manuel Noriega in Panama. And so this is part of a long line of we've long utilized different. We've had this thing. It used to be called Joint Task Force 6, and today it's called Joint Task Force North, where we operate military elements at the Mexican border to interdict drug trafficking, and the Coast Guard has been very involved in drug interdiction off the coast of the United States, and the Navy's been very involved into the Caribbean and also overseas around the Philippines and up in the South China Sea and stuff. So in that sense, this is kind of more of the norm. How there's, if you know, there's been a little trend line where we're increasingly militarizing this war on drugs. We're making it more and more into a real war, which we kind of did the same thing with the war on terror. For many years, the U.S. military and the intelligence agencies and international law enforcement agencies, including the Americans, part of the DEA and FBI and so forth, were long going after terrorists. But it took 9/11 for it to get fully militarized. And so we might be in a trend line toward that. So that is one potential explanation, that this is, we've been moving in this direction for a long time. And again, a part of this comes out of a bit like the whole foreign aid stuff is, when President Trump was former president, he was running to become president again. He said, well, if you elect me president, I'm going to take care of this fentanyl issue. I'm going to, he did a lot of tough talk. I'm going to have the death penalty for dealing dope, and I'm going to go after these guys in the way that the other guys didn't, and so on and so forth. And he got into power again, and so this would be a you could see this as an application of this. Now, having said that, there's long been an idea that Venezuela has been a thorn in American president's side, dating all the way back to Hugo Chavez, who was Maduro's predecessor. And so some are looking at this as this is the ratcheting up for another Panama, where we will actually utilize the military as a big giant police force, and we will go in and hit Venezuela. Some have seen this in the way of connections with Cuban influence in the Caribbean, and in Russian influence, Chinese influence in the area, and so on and so forth. So it's been caught up in a lot of international politics. And this has caused a sort of it's a bit like some of the stuff with the Russia-Ukrainian stuff. There's been a fissure in the Republican Party in particular, but especially in the MAGA base that backs President Trump. Where, on one hand, President Trump spent a lot of time talking about how we're not gonna have any wars anymore, not gonna have any foreign wars. We're cutting back. Professor Hall did that. That's the heart of American first, and that's actually not a new idea. That kind of isolationism goes all the way back to the beginnings of our republic. And George Washington said, beware the affairs of Europe and stuff. But there was actually the original name, America First, was actually named a movement in the 1930s for the United States to avoid what was going on in Europe at the time, which was the rise of the Nazis and the fascists, and of course the communists in the USSR. And as the rest of the world was inching towards what became World War II, the American firsters then would stay out. So we have this going on here where people have argued, and some out there like Tucker Carlson and some of these others have said, well, President Trump's not living up to what he said. We've got thousands of Marines and sailors in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific right now, hugging right on hitting those little boats, the little speed boats. There's some question of the legality. There's some question of can you utilize the military. If Secretary Rubio was here, he would tell you, well, we have authorization for the usage of military force via the 2001 act that was done in the wake of 9/11. Because we've designated these narco terrorists, and so hence they're terrorists. So this is a part of the war on terror. But of course, the problem with all of that is that President Trump is very proud of the fact that he orchestrated the agreement that was put in by President Biden. He didn't like Biden's implementation of it, but that ended GWAT, ended the global war on terror, with the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. So at least supposedly we're not at war. So supposedly there is no AUMF, except that there still is on the book. So they're using it. So can they really do that? That's a whole legalistic thing. Now, presidents have been making wars ever since there's been presidents. Congress may declare war, but presidents make war for good, bad, or indifferent reasons. In fact, the literature, if you look at it, there's been over 200 what the scholars call militarized disputes. That just means combat, somebody shooting at somebody. And this would fall under one of those. Is this going to lead to an actual, what we might call an extra interstate war between us and Venezuela? The claim by the Trump administration, which by the way was also a claim by the Biden administration, is that Maduro is utilizing his power, that he's corrupt, he's connected with the cartels and run through. And but I will say this, if you're using that argument, that's also a little bit problematic, because you could say the same thing about Colombia. And we get far more dope from Colombia than we get from Venezuela. I mean, far more. And if you really want to play that card, you can talk about Mexico. we get way more. That's the main funnel point. So what does this really mean? And so I'm a little bit unsure. We are playing some great power politics in this. We are talking about the war on drugs in this. President Trump has said that we're not gonna invade Venezuela, but yet we have all those Marines out there, and Marines really only have one purpose, and that's nothing against them. I'm an old Army guy, but there's nothing against the Corps, but it's really only got one purpose. It doesn't go for boat rides for the enjoyment of it. But I'm not sure really where we land on this, where this is going to go. But one thing I will say, and now I'm going to turn this over to John, is that I think that they really ought to think about this a little bit, just because The administration is utilizing military force regarding the policing of the cities right now. Again, that's a whole other can of worms. At the same time that they're talking about contributing to an international stabilization force in Gaza, if that ceasefire holds. At the same time that they're talking about that they have to amp things up and continued support to keep Ukraine afloat. One thing they need to take a really consideration is, does the United States have the manpower, the resources? We have the most powerful military on the planet, but I'm telling you that the military that exists today is half the size of what it was some years ago. And I do question whether we really have the resources to do what we're doing, especially when we're $38 trillion in hole, and so on and so forth. But we don't have that many people. If you add everybody up, I talked about the Marines. The whole Marine Corps has less than 200,000 people in it. You're not going to sustain an extended conflict doing that with boots on the ground. And so I think that the Trump administration might have that in the back of their mind. And they can talk about that they're meeting their recruiting goals, and they are, mostly because they lowered the numbers so they can meet the recruiting goals. So we don't have the people. So I think they really ought to think about that. That, by the way, was a little self-serving because of the other jobs. I'll just say that. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Matt. I just noticed we were running low on time, but I think you did a great job there. In terms of the heart of the question, what's the real strategy? I think you hit it. If this truly were drug interdiction, we would be amassing naval forces off of Colombia and Mexico. So I don't necessarily know, not to mention, I think right now there are like 3 Arleigh Burke class missile destroyers, a Ticonderoga class cruiser, a Virginia class nuclear submarine, and the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier group is on the way. That is overkill for drug interdiction. That would lead to the possibility of regime change or trying to maintain influence in the area. It is the source of Venezuela does have the largest proven oil reserves on the planet Earth. So could there be strategic strikes in the future? Possibly. I don't necessarily think so. I think the best possible real strategy behind this might simply be something that all elected leaders take part in, and it's political theater. There is nothing that is more successful for Democrats, Republicans, Independents than appearing tough on crime. And I think that amassing these naval assets and not necessarily utilizing them aggressively could simply be a way of something that Democrats or Republicans might do, and that is just to look tough on crime and to project force to the base. But we will see. I'm hoping it's nothing more than political theater. And we are out of time.
Yeah, we have basically run out of time. So thank you all for your questions. Didn't get to everything, but that's okay. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you in the audience for your questions in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Hull and Dr. Caverly, for your insights as well. So this is the last of our planned discussion events for this semester. We'll probably have some in the spring when we'll hopefully be able to talk about some of these things we didn't get to today, and hopefully be able to do that. As far as if you do want to review this discussion later, if you want to go and view some of our previous discussions, you can find those on our YouTube page. It's just youtube.com/@MJPaulSci, and also available as a podcast as well. If you're into the podcast thing, I think it is set up to do that. I don't know how, but I just hit the button for it to be a podcast, so it's a podcast. Not sure how popular it is, but we'll see. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and hope everybody has a good remainder of their day and a good remainder of your week. And hopefully, we'll see you at an upcoming event sometime in the spring.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for coming. Have a great day.